Hey everyone, it's Matt here with Nightrun Studio, and I've got some shocking news. For the last 2 months, I actually stuck to my plan. No restarting the game, no chasing new shiny features, no late night maybe I should rewrite the entire player controller system moments. I just followed the plan. And honestly, the results have been pretty awesome. Back in January, I talked about switching to a patch-based development system. The idea was simple, short, sprint-like goals, but the rule I gave myself was the important part. Finish and bug fix one feature completely before starting another. At the time I was working on patch 5. Since then, I finished 5 more patches. So much progress, in fact, that I'm splitting this into 2 devlogs. So, let's take a look at what's been cooking in the Nightrun Studio kitchen. When we last left poor Willard, things were looking rough. Sure, he could collect weapon upgrades and arm peasants, but otherwise he mostly just stood around watching his village slowly slide into ruin, which gameplay-wise is not ideal. It was pretty clear that Willard needed something meaningful to do, so I started by adding resource collection. Now, players can gather wood while exploring, and I wired it up to the inventory so that you can actually see it displayed. Then, I built a woodshed where you can store the wood you collect. But once that was working, I ran into an obvious problem. Collecting wood is great and all, but if the player can't actually use it, it's basically just a slightly more boring version of a coin. So I gave Willard the ability to build structures. It's not hooked up to the economy yet, you can build pretty freely, but it did at least prevent players from constructing buildings in midair or inside of obstacles. Small victories. I also integrated my second villager, Burn. He acts tough, but if he doesn't have a weapon, he just panics and cowers. Give him a weapon though, and suddenly he's ready to defend the village. Now, during all this playtesting, another issue became obvious. Villagers would sometimes randomly stop fighting enemies, which is not great during a monster attack. So I wrote down the worst combat issues and added them into the plan for the next patch. At this point, the next big problem became pretty clear. Villagers needed something useful to do besides fighting or patrolling relentlessly in circles. I decided the village needed builders. So, patch 7 introduced the builder job. First, I upgraded the woodshed door animation, because obviously that's the most important part. Then I created a construction scaffold system. When the player places a building, it now spawns a scaffold instead of a finished structure. But I didn't want the player doing all the work. The whole idea of the game is that the villagers help rebuild the village. So now you can recruit a villager, assign them as a builder, and tell them which project to work on. They'll go to the woodshed, grab the wood they need, and start building. And you'll have to make sure to stock up that shed because they're going to come back for more once they've run out of resources. The scaffold even animates through construction stages, and when the work's finished, the building appears. Then the villager goes back to defending the village. Except, of course, when they don't. Ugh. Remember those combat bugs I said I'd fix? Well, I did. Apparently Heimer just enjoys firing arrows at absolutely nothing while the village is under attack, which is technically a strategy. More notes for the next patch. At this point I wanted some early feedback. Conveniently, I teach a high school programming class, which means I have access to a room full of brutally honest playtesters. At this point the game worked, but it didn't quite feel finished enough to show yet, so patch 8 became my student-ready demo patch. I added the first sound effects and music, spent a couple of weeks fixing bugs, and cleaned up a lot of the tutorial elements. I also added blueprints, so certain buildings can only be constructed after you discover their plans. None of this work was particularly glamorous. It was mostly polish, cleanup, and bug fixing. But those kinds of changes make a big difference in how the game feels. As a result, the feedback from students was overwhelmingly positive for such a small demo. They liked the visual improvements, the village building concept, they knew what to do. But their number one piece of feedback was very clear. Let us fight stuff. Fair enough. Around this time I was working on my Metroidvania tutorial series, and I'd implemented a slide mechanic that was just plain really fun. Sliding past enemies and attacking from behind felt great. When I went back to Willard's combat system, the old crouch walk state suddenly felt kinda boring. So I added a slide mechanic. The player lunges forward while the animation plays, and the collider shrinks so Willard can slip under low obstacles. It's actually a lot of fun. It also means I now have to animate an entire extra set of gear poses for every weapon and armor combination. Still, worth it. Now it was time to implement sword combat. At first I used a pretty standard approach, an attack point in front of the player, which checks for enemies within a circular range when the attack animation plays. It worked, but something felt off. Enemies were taking damage before the sword actually reached them. which meant Willard apparently mastered telekinetic sword combat. So I switched to a weapon hitbox system. Now each weapon has its own collider that follows the sword during its attack animation, and it only activates during the frames where the weapon is actually swinging. The result is that weapons feel much more physical and responsive, and different weapons can have different attack shapes, and honestly, combat's starting to feel really good. Here you can see the newest combat version in action, along with the slide mechanic. And that about wraps up this devlog. There's actually a lot more that's been happening. I've been working on things like reactive vegetation, non-combat critters, lighting improvements, and a whole bunch of world-building details. But I'll save those for the next devlog. For now though, I'd love to hear what you think. Does Willard's Village look like something you'd enjoy playing? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, this is Matt with Nightrun Studio. Cheers.